seen on the Jeopardy show, or the big servers, the big mainframes. These are the kind of computers that sit off at some distant place and run all the big systems of the world. You know, the airline reservation systems, your banking systems, all those things. So you're not going to see us at Walmart. You're not going to see us, you know, in the retail space, but we're kind of that infrastructure underneath a lot of things. So with that, one point I make there, the packaging industry is bigger than you may think. I just like to start the thing, we're at school here, let's do a little quiz here. Anyone care to guess what the value of the worldwide packaging industry is, 2013? Let's go around the room. How about an MSU volunteer? I see a lot of green shirts out there. Anyone want to hazard a guess? Price is right. Take a guess. 40 billion, all right. Virginia Tech, you guys, you're in the room here, what do you think? 500 billion, big number. We have any RIT people here yet? Yep, one? Take a shot at it.
20 billion.
I'm sorry?
20 billion.
20 billion. Okay, well we heard yesterday, Print Pack by themselves are at 1.4 billion. Packaging Corporation America, 5.5. Well, guess what? 797 billion in 2013. So congratulations, Zach, you won the Price is Right. Expected to grow to 975 billion by 2018, when some of you may be graduating. So what does that tell you? Congratulations, you made a good choice. This is a big, big business. We're important. We're onto something here. So just take that and realize that, when you're talking to your buddies who tease you about being a packaging engineer, ask them, what kind of industry are you getting into? Is it bigger than this? Probably not. So what's the IBM logistics supply chain look like? We actually have what's known as a fourth-party logistics system. We actually have one logistics contract worldwide with a company called Geodis. And then they, in turn, own all the contracts with all the other carriers, freight forwarders, warehouse companies, you name it. So it simplifies our management infrastructure. We just have the one contract to deal with Geodis, and then they kind of sit on top of the rest of it. We are primarily what's known as business-to-business supply chain. We're not, like I said, we're not selling to households, we're not selling to retail space. It's all selling big systems to other big companies primarily. One of the big trends is we're going into what's called the BRIC countries. Of course, Brazil, Russia, India, China. And there's another whole phase beyond that now. Africa is growing. It is actually a very large emerging market for us. Costs, transportation, as Dr. White indicated earlier, the cost of transportation is usually much higher, quantum leap above the cost of packaging, but yet, it's just as he said, there's always someone pounding on your head to get the packaging costs down. So we do ship in all modes, mostly air and truck. We have a little bit of ocean and rail, but not as much, because we're just not even though we're a big company, we're really not a high volume, kind of like chunking out truckloads upon truckloads of stuff every day going to one place. So packaging engineering, I think we've probably heard this in your classes, but the wonderful thing about this, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's a wonderful career because it covers the entire business entity, from inbound raw material suppliers all the way through your own manufacturing fulfillment onto the end customer, and even beyond that, the reverse logistics of the product after it's already been used up and has to be recovered for recycling purposes. So you can be involved in all of that, which is wonderful. This is a conceptual view, and it's similar to the one Dr. White showed earlier, where you have these circles of influence. You've got the product design, you've got the package design, you've got the handling and the carrier involvement, and I would add there's a fourth element, that is the client itself, how they interface with all of this whole system. And all of it gets better. The center, the overall effectiveness and performance increases proportionally to the growth of all of those circles. So we're usually in packaging, we're focused on the packaging part, but I would submit to you that part of your greater influence is actually influencing the product if you can. And in IBM, what that means is working with the product designers to make that product more rugged through shock and vibration testing. If we can improve the ruggedness of the product, then less packaging is necessary. And then that's when you really have leverage. We'll talk about more of that later. Here's an example of, we saw a lot of LTL views here. Here's air cargo. You can tell there that the shape of the airplane itself dictates the shape of the load. The belly freight there, which is what's underneath the passenger compartment of an airplane. This is how things are going to be loaded in the belly. You can see it looks like an upside down load because of just the shape of the airplane itself. Normally we think trucks are cubic, well, airplanes are not. Putting square pegs in a round hole. Here's some other interesting challenges. I don't know if I understand these pictures are a little dark, but now we're taking a view into the international space here a little bit. You see there in the lower left, that's actually a refrigerator being delivered on a bicycle in India. So not exactly the forklift handling we described that John showed you earlier. On the right, thankfully you can't hardly see it, there's some IBM boxes there that are about half as tall as they ought to be. And why? It's because they were all manually handled. Like John said, everything in LTL is forklift handled. But when you get outside of the United States, it gets out into these emerging growth markets, mechanical handling is by far the exception, not the rule. Everything's going to be manually handled in those places. So you have this beautiful pallet and this beautiful load sitting on a pallet, and all of a sudden they take that pallet off, and the rest of it's manually handled. It starts to fall apart if it's not designed with that in mind. So in a worldwide situation, you got to think about how is this going to work both mechanically handled and manually handled. In some cases, that pallet all it did was add a bunch of extra weight to it. It made it even harder for them to handle. So here's a couple more examples of that. You see, your trucks are not exactly what we're used to seeing here in this country. They're typically smaller. Things that you think would fit don't, so they lay them down when they shouldn't be, and so on. How about this, Africa? There's some kind of a barge going across a river, right? Roads, not even paved. You see, it's a very interesting environment. If you start getting outside your the United States borders. Here's an interesting consequence. We take for granted that the product we make, because we can move it out of our facility here, will make it to the client's facility without an issue. Here we are in Brazil with a high-end rack server that's somewhere upwards of 89 inches tall, maybe. Didn't fit through the door. Couldn't even get into the building. They had to close off the streets, get a crane, and go through the roof. Can you imagine? Crazy. Here's some other real-life incidents. I'm showing you some uglies here. I mean, normally we'd like to show you all the pristine stuff, but this is reality. This is what we're dealing with. These are all examples of port handling, where different things happened. The lift gate failed. It wasn't strong enough for the load. The forklift went around the bend too fast, whatever it may be. The load's not secured to the sidewalls of the truck, so on and so forth. And these are all catastrophes when you're shipping $1 million server to somebody. Every single one of them is a total, complete disaster. So I want to give a shout out to Dr. Horvath and some of the people where we have a team called the Rack Transportability Team, where we're starting to look at these situations with these very large products to see if maybe there's something that could be done in the packaging design to help prevent some of these handling errors. So there we are. We've been meeting kind of on a monthly basis for a few years, kind of gradually creeping along on some ideas to try to improve the packaging, testing, and handling for these very large, top-heavy products, just to see what we can accomplish. I'll show you a few things that we've already achieved, and then we're continuing right here at Virginia Tech research on the bottom deck forces to prevent that incident you see there in the lower right. If you can barely see that, that's a It's a server that tipped off a forklift after it went around the bend too fast. The bottom decks, of course, tore off just because the leverage was too much. So we're looking to see, could they possibly have been made strong enough to prevent that tip over? You know, and how strong would it have to be to actually achieve that? So some of the things we did was we created a handling guide. It's very detailed. It's on the ISTA website. But then we realized, that was meant to be a training guide, but then we thought, is there some way we could cull this down, like the Cliff Notes version, to one page? What are the biggest messages we want to convey, and how do we do that? Well, we created a number of symbols, handling symbols, which you see some of them represented here, related to not laying the product down, and check make sure the weight is not exceeding the capacity of the lift gate. Strap the item while it's on the lift gate to the truck itself to prevent it from tipping off the end. Some of these things we know aren't routinely done, but we're hoping to try to introduce some new procedures and new handling steps for these types of products where possible. So these are some of the symbols that were developed, and actually it was an interesting project because we engaged a human factors research firm in Cary, North Carolina. We did some testing of the symbols. We designed them ourselves and then did some testing with people that are actually in the industry of handling things to see if they comprehended the symbol and so forth, and did some more testing in Czech Republic on the same symbols to try to get an international view. And they tested acceptably. So the idea being that, like John said, not everyone around the world speaks English, so you need to communicate without the use of words wherever you can, especially in an international environment. So we're starting to see some of these things being used on our packaging. Of course, it doesn't substitute for a better package, which is also what we're trying to do, but if anything we can do to help, we'll try to do it. So let's shift gears a little bit to some other challenges. This is generally the perception of packaging by the public, right? Everyone, all they think about is the waste that is created. They don't think about the waste that prevented. The product getting damaged is the worst possible environmental outcome, and we know that. But they take for granted that the product's not going to get damaged, and then of course the packaging is the first waste generated by the system, so it's very visual. So back to this conceptual view that I introduced earlier, IBM kind of has a holistic view about the environment, and that is that you can't just look at it just, all right, we're going to pick this pack over this one, or this material over the other one. We want to look at it in the total picture. If we can design the product in a way that the rack server can ship within the frame and not require a separate package, it's like the ultimate, right? The best package is no package, right? So there's an example. Or if the product can be made rugged enough such that a more sustainable material could be used, which I'll show you some more, instead of, say, a traditional polypropylene foam or something, if we can enable a more sustainable solution because it's more rugged, for instance. Those are the kind of things we want to do. And then also continue to work with carriers and try to learn from their world, how they do things. And then also the client. If we're shipping a product 10,000 miles and going through 50 handling steps, it's unreasonable for that package to arrive completely pristine. And it doesn't need to, right? It really ought not to have to be perfectly pristine, but yet when you're buying a $10,000 server, people think, geez, I really want that package to look pristine. So this is our view. It's more holistic. We want all these factors. We want to influence all these factors if we can. So some of the exciting things that are coming out, and some of you may have seen these, sustainable packaging innovations. I mean, in the last 10 years, it's been remarkable. And I'm sure that some of you, and what you're learning in this school program, may be introducing even some more. We're seeing a lot of interest in foamless cushions because, face it, your typical styrene foam or polyethylene foam, once it's made, it doesn't degrade, it's bulky, it takes up a lot of space, and so forth, hard to recycle. So all these are very exciting. The Reflex is a vacuum formed cushion made from recycled milk jugs, among other things. We have actually mushroom-based packaging, which is interesting. It's naturally flame retardant. We're even looking to use it in some product applications because of that. CoreView, a sealed air product where it's a suspension of corrugated in a very resilient film. And we see these starch-based materials that dissolve in water. All these are very exciting things out there, and introduce a lot of more choices to the engineer. But because of that, there's a lot of challenges in trying to sort through all those to decide which ones to use for a given application. Public policy pressure. This is another interesting area. I got personally involved in this one. Country, United Arab Emirates, was looking to require all 15 of those types of plastics in the upper right to be made from oxo-degradable materials, including any bags, single-use bags, stretch film, shrink film, overwraps, bubble wrap, cushioning, all these things. If you're importing any of those materials or looking to sell any of those materials in that country, they have to be oxo-degradable. Thankfully, that requirement didn't extend to importers shipping packaged products into the country. They drew the line. They didn't realize that was unreasonable. But nonetheless, it's a tip of the iceberg of what we would expect to come in the future, where more countries are going to start looking at and requiring these things. So the first phase of it is, you've probably seen a number of states and countries are looking to ban those carry-away grocery bags, right? The paper or plastic decision you're all faced with at the grocery store, those plastic bags are under attack because they're so thin, they tend to blow around in the environment, they cause a lot of litter. An interesting case in the United Arab Emirates, one of the reasons why they're looking to ban these materials is because 50% of premature camel deaths are caused by ingesting those thin, ultra-thin plastic bags, if you can believe it. And that's the truth. You can't make this stuff up. So that's a sacred situation over there, and they're going to do whatever it takes. And all you need is one large economy like that to set the bar there. In our world, we can't design country-specific packaging. It's got to be one size fits all. So that, as the new requirements start kicking in, that becomes the highest common denominator that we have to apply globally. So that's why we have to monitor these things carefully. Here's a case where I'm looking at that fourth circle of the chart, client expectations. Here's a case where, in IBM we think we've done a pretty good job of design and testing. We have very, very, very low actual product damage rates despite shipping around the world. But yet we still have clients that will reject a product on account of a scuff in the carton or a little crease or a little bent corner or something. And this is a case where, what's the really true sustainable package? Is it this, which got the job done, prevented damage, and arrived? Or do we have to package the package just to keep the package looking good, right? That's like extra layers, extra materials, not really sustainable, not really the ultimate in sustainability. So there's a perception, a mindset that we have to kind of get around in this business-to-business environment where, the shelf-ready presence, like you would expect in a retail store, that phenomenon doesn't really apply in business. So there ought to be a different set of rules there. Here's an interesting element. Toxics in packaging. Since 20 years now, 19 states have had limits on heavy metals in packaging. It's probably well known: lead, mercury, hexachrome, and cadmium. But now we're starting to see even that is getting stretched. Other requirements, packaging essential requirements. This is an EU directive which requires that you have achieved the ultimate in source reduction up front. That you can demonstrate that the amount of packaging you're using is essential to do the job and nothing more. Furthermore, beyond that, the packaging has to be recoverable through one of these four options. Either through energy recovery, which is when you incinerate it and it recover the energy from that by incinerating it. And of course, all your plastics, corrugated wood would all comply with that. Then you have the recycling, of course. That's, most people think of recycling as the first option for material recovery. And then the other two are reuse or composting and biodegradation. In IBM, we typically are on the left side of the chart through energy recovery or recycling, but simply because reuse is not typically a viable option when you're shipping, halfway around the world. It's really not the environmental outcome to send that thing empty all the way back to the beginning in most cases. Here's another example of a toxic substance restrictions related to packaging. This is the REACH directive in Europe. There's actually now over 100 restricted substances that we have to check on in packaging materials now. And these are from your chemistry classes, those words that are like 28 letters long, They typically fall in the categories of biocides that might be used in mold prevention, or you guys deal in Virginia Tech a lot with woods and stuff. Those may be used in wood treatments. Brightly colored inks and dyes are typically where some of these heavy metals show up. Adhesives, paper making, like boric acid, things like that. Plasticizers, your phthalates, the things that make plastics flexible. These are all substances that are now being scrutinized because of their human health effects. So what does it do? It causes a big bureaucracy, frankly, having to go back all the way up through your supply chain and have your suppliers tell you that they don't have any of these substances, more than 1/10 of 1% by weight of the article. And then it creates this whole up and down the line communication system. So again, it's a part of packaging you may not have been introduced to before, but something you're likely to get involved with if you deal in an international business. Here's another one, California rigid plastic packaging. They require any container between an equivalent volume of 8 ounces to 5 gallons to be made of 25% post-consumer recycled content, or be reusable 5 cycles or more, or be recycled at 45% or more by the end user, or be refillable and so forth, or have a source reduction of 10% or more compared with the prior version, which can be achieved through like product concentration or other things like that. So here you go, there's one state introducing its own requirement, and of course, once you have it in one place, you pretty much have to do it everywhere. Interestingly, containers that don't even hold liquids or powders are in scope of this. For instance, like a blister pack that might hold a cell phone or something. If that happened to be, if you could pour 8 ounces of liquid into it, that would be within scope of the regulation. So you have to be careful. Don't just presume it's buckets and jars and things like that. Here's another thing we deal with. It's called, I call green procurement. This isn't even regulatory, but this is where your clients or your customers are imposing requirements in some way or another, which may be above and beyond regulatory requirements. So here, this is called EP, the Electronics Products Environmental Assessment Tool. This is a voluntary program through the EPA where different types of products like computers or monitors or laptops or whatever have a requirement that includes things like, that you've guaranteed that there's the toxics that I mentioned earlier are not there, that the packaging is designed in such a way that they can be separable without tools to enable and augment recycling efforts, that all the plastics are recyclable and labeled with their resin codes. So these are required, some of these are required if they have an R in front of them, O for optional. Declaration of recycled content. If you have recycled content in it, you're supposed to declare it. So what does this do? It's voluntary, but in some ways it isn't really, right? I mean, if all your clients say it's voluntary, but then if you don't do it, you can't sell to them, how voluntary is it really? These are some of the other criteria meeting the EPA comprehensive post-consumer recycled content guidelines. Actually having a provision for taking back your own packaging. Can you imagine? Having to recover packaging yourself as a manufacturer when there's a whole infrastructure for waste management also in place. It seems kind of ridiculous to me, but yet it's, you have to say, oh yeah, I'm willing to come get it if you insist on it. So here's another thing. You may have, here in school, you may be talking about the wood issues with pest quarantines, International Standard for Phytosanitary Measures. This is the standard that deals with the Asian longhorn beetle and the pinewood nematode and some of these things that, some of these forest diseases that were coming into the country thanks to poorly made pallets. So most people think environmental packaging. You think of paper versus plastic, recyclability, recoverability, that type of thing. Well, here's an actual environmental catastrophe that happened that had a packaging vector to it. And so you can imagine if you're importing pests that then go spread out into the woods and eat up all the maple trees, and now Vermont can't sell maple syrup because all their trees are destroyed by the Asian beetle. That's a real environmental catastrophe. So here we have a case where us little packaging people are having to solve this issue. So what is this? I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the standard exists where you have to treat the materials with heat or with chemicals, methyl bromide, fumigation, so forth. Exempted from that are processed wood materials like your plywoods, masonite, OSB, and timber strand, those types of materials that are heavily processed, mixed with glues and resins. Those are exempt. The interesting thing that arises from that, though, is that because those materials are exempt, they don't get the IPPC symbol stamped on them. And because of that, they sometimes get stopped at international borders because the inspectors are a little bit, tunnel vision. They're looking for that symbol, and the symbol's not there. And the symbol's not there because it's not allowed to be there. So it's like this catch-22 that happens. So these are the examples of the exempt materials I mentioned before, your plywoods, OSBs, and so forth. It's great to use these materials because they're not subject to infestation. So we do use quite a bit of this. These are examples of the ones that do have to have the logo. This is all your solid stringer block style pallets made of cut lumber. Those have to have that, they have to be treated, they have to be stamped with a symbol like you see in the lower right there. Or they won't be allowed into a lot of countries in the world. I think there's close to 100 countries now that are signatories to the International Plant Protection Convention. And that's what the IPPC stands for. Here's an example we ran into. I call it no good deed goes unpunished. It's a case where we made a pack completely made out of exempt materials, shipped to Peru. It got stopped because it didn't have the IPPC symbol on it. And it didn't because it wasn't allowed to have it on there because the materials were exempt. So here's a case where we may very well been better off to put a little piece of solid wood with the symbol stamped on it, just nailed to the side, just so that we could be allowed to use the symbol so that they can have something to look at. So it's kind of a quirky situation, but anyway, it's what we run into sometimes. And again, these are the kind of the split of the different types of pallets and which ones are exempt and which ones are, and it's all or nothing. Either it has the logo or it doesn't have a logo, unfortunately. I've requested numerous times that the IPPC develop a symbol for exempt materials, but it hasn't landed or hasn't been embraced. Just so you'd have one symbol on there, either saying it's treated or it's exempt, so that there would always be something on there. At least for the materials that look like wood, or they might be, represented, look like something that might be requiring it. So anyway, I kind of did a whirlwind tour of various topics. I didn't get into depth on any one of them. Any one of the things I presented today could be its own seminar topic because there's a lot more to it than what I presented today. But I just want you to take away from this a wider perspective of what you might run into in packaging. when you get out into your jobs. You should feel good about what the choice you made. You know, you've landed here, you've made a choice, you're in a major, you're learning an exciting field. It's treated me well for going on 35 years in IBM now. I was just like you one day, looking around for majors and deciding what to do. And packaging is wonderful. And I would also congratulate Virginia Tech for having the wisdom to come up with its own packaging program. I mean, from when I was in school with Paul Koenig, what was it? 3 schools, I think, in the whole country had packaging programs, right? Now we're up to, what, 11 or 12? So I think it's fantastic. I want to just say that most of what I presented today will affect you in some way, or your company in some way, wherever you may be, if you're doing any kind of international shipment. And I would submit that just about everyone is. I mean, if your company you may be selling to a domestic client, but if that client is selling international, then that makes you international. So just don't forget that. The globalization, I mean, we showed the pictures from India and China and Africa. I mean, it's a wild world up there. And that's only going to increase the importance of the packaging skills that you're learning in school. So when you are in school and you're learning, get out and see as much as you can. You know, just go observe. If you can travel internationally, all the better. But just be aware that what you see in your grocery stores here in the United States, or what you see in your highways here, is quite a lot different once you get outside of the U.S. and start roaming the world a little bit. It's a whole lot more manual. It's a whole lot less sophisticated in a lot of places. So you just got to keep that in mind when you're developing packaging. And then one of the other key things I want to remind you again is that once you have a requirement, you're shipping in a global business, that next highest bar gets set by somebody, that becomes your denominator for the rest of the world. I mean, to operate efficiently, you can't have different packing methods for every country. It's just usually not efficient. At least in our example, in our company, we can't just customize it for the destination. What else? And I would just back to the point about the holistic view. Think about not just the pack design you're doing, but look at opportunities to maybe influence the product design itself, to see how it could be enabled to be more rugged, or maybe the dimensions all adjusted slightly so that it fits better in transport vehicles or fits better on pallets. It was the point that Dr. White gave earlier. How can you go up the chain a little bit and influence, or down the chain a little bit and do your influence that way, and then let the overall system be more efficient. I think that's a wonderful message that he shared. I would certainly corroborate that. And so, I mean, that's just it. I mean, it's an exciting field. I congratulate you for making the decision to jump into this fray. The future's bright. It's getting more and more important. It's getting more and more complicated. So I think there's tremendous opportunity for all of you out there. So with that, I'll take any questions, if there are any. Yes?
Earlier you mentioned the common denominator regulations kind of policy that IBM does for the global packaging that they do. When a new regulation is presented that may have a major role in some of the packaging systems that you guys have going on, do you guys approach the problem by doing a study such as a life cycle assessment or something else to solve the issue, where you find the different problems in the packaging system, or do you kind of outsource it to your suppliers where you have them take a closer look?
Well, we're not doing life cycle assessment to that level of detail. It's definitely a collaborative effort with the material suppliers we deal with, because there's a lot of outsourcing being done. It's not just the packaging supplier's involvement, but even the manufacturing might be outsourced to a contract manufacturer, so there's a lot of moving parts there. But we're still mostly in traditional materials. Some of the things I presented earlier are still kind of under study and being looked at. Part of that is because we've got something that works, at a very, very high level, and so it's taken a lot of to get us to move off some of the things we're already using. Because again, the worst possible outcome is the product damage. It's the worst environmental client option. The worst possible outcome altogether is when the product fails. So, especially in the type of products we're talking about, that were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So, a lot of those sustainable materials are niche. We're fitting them into niches a little bit in less critical applications, just because the cost of failure is too high. So, hope that answers your question. Yes?
How has the global climate with sustainable initiatives changed IBM's waterproofing for the packaging?
Waterproofing? Well, we're typical, like most shippers. I mean, we cover the product with a poly bag and a corrugated and stretch wrap, so we're not really waterproofing it per se. We do use some VCI materials for some things for rust prevention, because you ship, some countries have a lot of bad air pollution, can cause rust problems actually. Or products like in Hong Kong, they're stored, sea level, and they're near water, and if they're sitting there too long, they can get rust on them. So we do use VCI materials to help with that, from volatile corrosion inhibitors. These are the materials I hope you're familiar with. They have a chemistry that's proprietary that outgasses within the package and actually prevents the oxidation of the metals, the ferrous metals in the product. It's interesting technology. It provides rust protection without having to have a perfectly hermetic seal. You can imagine trying to apply a hermetic seal to a machine that weighs 3,000 pounds. It's not simple to do. Yes?
You mentioned you were involved with the issue of the UAE plastic bags. How exactly was that happening to IBM, and what did you do to mediate that?
Right. What happened with that one was we saw the regulation come across, and then we saw the way it was written, and of course it was written in Arabic, so we had to have a local outside counsel evaluate it and to tell us if they thought we were in scope of the regulation. Our first assessment was that we were not in scope. That imported packaged products were not in scope. It was only the raw commodities being imported were in scope. That's the first wave. But then what happened was some other companies, cell phone companies and some others, started probing and asking questions, and they got contradictory answers from the authorities there. So how we got involved was we got hooked up with the U.S. UAE Business Council in Washington, and also with some trade associations to try to develop some question sets to try to make sure that we were getting the right interpretation from the authorities. So that was the involvement. So part of it was arguing the fact that, if they were to stop imported packaged products that had stretch wrap on them or bubble wrap or cushions, they would effectively shut the borders down, because let's face it, everything just about has one of those materials involved with it. So we just wanted them to understand that, and even their own website said that 95% of the materials that they're targeting are manufactured locally. So our point was, hey, it's walk before we run. Let's control. If they want to control that, fine, but you can't shut the border down. You can't expect the entire world to suddenly make everything oxo-degradable. That's just totally impossible to achieve over a short term. And they've, understood that eventually and made that clear to us. So that basically that was the involvement, was just to get clarity on that interpretation and calm everyone down, I guess, put it that way. Because there was a lot of panic. Business executives are looking at this and saying, geez, please don't tell me I can't ship my servers into UAE on account of stretch wrap. That would be totally wrong. Wrong thing to tell an executive that, well, I'm sorry, we got to stretch wrap that thing, or it won't make it. So thankfully it didn't turn out that way. But even with that, even though we kind of escaped that one, it's still an indicator of what we're up against, because we're going to start to see more and more countries come out with these things. And then the next one may, in fact, get us. So we have to always be diligent and see how these things go, and try to work some advocacy around it to get to some common sense. So, all right. Well, thank you for your time today. I enjoyed being here, and it's nice meeting all of you, and I wish you a successful rest of your seminar.
Thank you, Bob Sanders. We really appreciate the time that both of the speakers